Admit it, you've used the same password in more than one spot. It's tough to admit, isn't it? Imagine that password or some password you've got is protecting data. And that data is incredibly important to you for a bunch of reasons. This is the challenge we're about to talk about, and you're about to hear from somebody who is solving a really interesting and challenging problem around cryptographic key security. This is Daniel Gallancy of Atakama, and this is the DiscoPosse podcast, and it starts now. Welcome to the DiscoPosse podcast. I'm excited because this is a really cool conversation I had with Daniel Gallancy. He's doing some really crazy cool stuff in cryptographic key security. You get to hear what it means, why it's important, and on top of that, we get into the ethics of security and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and really cool stuff around people in the community and the impact in the world. It's amazing. In the meantime, if you dig these kind of conversations, make sure you do hit the like button, hit subscribe, and keep in touch when things like this happen. So drop us a comment. If you like the content you're seeing, it'd be super cool for you to give feedback. Helps to make sure that more people like you get to hear great conversations like this. With that, let's get into the good stuff. This is Daniel Gallancy of Atakama, and this is the DiscoPosse podcast.
My name is Daniel Gallancy, and I'm the CEO of Atakama, and you are listening to the DiscoPosse podcast.
Thing of beauty. And with that, we jump right in. So Daniel, thank you very much for joining. I've had the advantage of listening to a lot of your content. You have a spectacular radio voice, so I'm excited about the chance to have this on here. But beyond that, you are a wicked smart human, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to talk about. So for folks that are brand new to you, if you don't mind, introduce yourself, and then we're going to talk about Atakama, kind of the challenges that you're solving. And you've got a lot of neat things that we're going to explore. Luckily, we got some good time in front of us.
Sure, I'm Dan. I'm some guy who right now lives in upstate New York and works in a laundry room. Is that a good intro? Or
I always love that. Yeah, for folks that are watching the video,
detail?
They get to enjoy it fully. But it's like the audio one, they're like, "What is he talking about?" Like, watch the YouTube. That's where the fun is.
Yeah. So in my normal life, I run a terrific software company called Atakama. We make encryption software. It's really distributed key management software, and I could talk about what I mean by that when we get further into it. We are normally based in New York City. Right now, we are distributed because of COVID, and I'm working at a house in upstate New York, and the only space for an office was in the laundry room. So, which makes for an amusing background. But yeah, that's the quick intro.
Now, the challenges we've got right now, which is like my favorite thing to tell people, it's like I saw a great title in an article the other day. It says the S in IoT stands for security, and the first thing you think is like, well, there is no S. Like, exactly. Like, so we're security for whatever reason, especially encryption. It is such an unfortunate afterthought, and it is so vastly underappreciated for how necessary it is. And I looked, I've been studying what you and the team are doing, and some people have a bit of an awareness of the idea of zero trust networking, but that assumes that everything's traveling, and that's where the encryption's needed, but it's needed everywhere. So if you want to, let's talk about your particular solution and why it's really important.
Sure. So, and I think what you've said about zero trust networking, ZTNA is, I think, where most people focus when they hear the word zero trust. But you're exactly right. Zero trust is really conceptually about far more than that. And one of the big problems that we have is the way we deal with data at rest. Not just data in transit. I would almost say that the problem of securing data in transit is I'm going to use air quotes here, a solved problem. Insofar as there are an abundance of very good solutions out there, and if they are applied properly, you should be in good shape. Whereas securing data at rest becomes a far dicier proposition. And if you think about, for example, just the average user at home, let's make this sort of very accessible to any random person who could be listening. You have a computer; it has files, right? You have unstructured data. Right? It's sitting in files, right? You have Word docs, you have Excel files, you have PDFs, you've got your tax returns, you've got this thing, you've got your grocery list. Nobody cares about your grocery list, hopefully, unless you're buying some weird groceries. But how is all that stuff secured? And the answer in general is that it's secured with some sort of parameter. Whether we think about it as a parameter or don't think about it as a parameter, that's what it actually is. When you are merely logging into your computer, you are getting past some set of gates, some parameter. And once you're past those gates, you're in. It's open sesame. And the problem is if the you isn't actually you, right? What if it's not Eric Wright, but fake Eric Wright? Right? Not EW, but FEW, right? So EW is supposed to get in, right? But FEW is not. And if FEW sneaks in somehow, then it's open sesame for FEW. And that means that you got 100,000 files on that particular system, and that could be a local machine, that could be a network map, that could be something in the cloud. It doesn't matter where, anywhere, right? Once it's open sesame, and then fake Eric Wright FEW has access to everything. And that's a big problem. So how do we mitigate that? And the answer is, a great way to do it would be to encrypt each file by file, all 100,000 files, each one with its own unique password. Sounds good.
Yeah. Very
difficult to memorize 100,000 unique high strength passwords, right? High entropy passwords. You can ask your users to do it. You're not going to get very far. You're also going to create other problems in terms of sharing those files. The whole accounting group needs to access one particular network share. What do you do? How do you deal with that? What do you do, right? So that solution doesn't work that well. But what you can do, and what we've done, is you can encrypt each file by file, and then take the keys and split them into pieces, shards, we call them, and take the shards and distribute them amongst various devices. And then when it's time to decrypt a file, you can utilize those shards to decrypt the file. And you have one shard on your laptop, and one shard on your phone, one shard on your iPad, and one shard is on your colleague's phone, et cetera, et cetera. And then you need a quorum of those shards, say 2 of 4, to decrypt. And by having 2 of those 4 shards, you're in, right? So Eric Wright gets access, and that's open sesame for him. And he should have access to all 100,000 files. But if fake Eric Wright gets in, and then fake Eric Wright is challenged to decrypt a particular file before accessing it, fake Eric Wright, hopefully, most likely, does not have the requisite number of devices to access that particular file. And that's the concept of using distributed key management in the context of encryption. It's a very long-winded way of me saying it's a very strong second layer of protection, and it's a zero trust mechanism of preventing attackers from accessing your data.
Well, and it's interesting when you talk about the, apply a complex password. Even if we were to do it just at, let's just say one file, one disk, or just like a single unit. I remember back in the day, because I took all these crazy certifications over my career, and the Microsoft certification, I said, God bless them. They figured this out. They actually gave a proper answer one time. It was about security. And it said, how do you secure an account in Active Directory? And it said, number 1 was make sure it's got a minimum length. Number 2, make sure it has a minimum life, so that you had to set it to expire. And number 3 was to set it to have complexity requirements. And the answer, if you chose all 3, was wrong, because they knew the human answer is if you make it complex and you make it expire all the time, then someone's going to write it down on a piece of paper and put it beside their laptop. And so they said, in fact, you're better to choose 2 of 3 and just make sure that you've got other auditing tools wrapped around it, which was interesting. But then that's like one thing, that's one password. Well, like you said, we're sharing resources. I've got a laptop. I'm going to go to a coffee shop. I'm going to connect to Wi-Fi. I'm going to do all these things. It's it's not the fact that data's moving off my laptop to a place and I need to protect it on the way. It's the fact that I'm on a network with an exposure point where someone can now get on and have unencrypted potential access to that local system. And that's we really we get wrapped around the axle on like the NSA is going to sniff it on the way somewhere. Like, well, number one, it is not moving your data around is not you can't do it. Like we have to email, we have to do certain things. But meanwhile, 99.999% of the life of any object, any file, any whatever is at rest. That's where it needs to be protected.
You're preaching to the choir, and I think you're right. I'm just not that worried about the NSA man in the middle and
Yeah, that's right.
me. Go ahead. Go ahead. First of all, I don't think they're really. I don't think that's the threat, right? I think that's the comic book threat, right? That's not the real world threat. Or look, maybe that's the privacy enthusiast threat, right? Is that you're worried about the NSA? And I'm picking on. I don't want to know why we're picking on it, but okay, we can pick.
Yeah, I always hate that. I'm like, I pick an example.
No,
I'm going to
it's
walk you
reasonable.
into
It's
this
reasonable.
tough conversation. Yeah.
No, it's reasonable. It's reasonable. Look, I have tremendous respect for the folks of the NSA, and they have some truly brilliant folks. But ultimately, if you run a company, your risk is not the NSA,
Right.
right? Your risk is an adversary, right? And if you're the average Joe, even if you care about privacy, which I do, right? So let's separate privacy and security for a moment. We can talk about that separation, right? Most companies care about security more than they do about privacy. Most individuals care about both, but I think there's more of an emphasis on privacy, and that is what it is. If you're an individual who cares deeply about privacy, there are an abundance of threats to your privacy, and I think focusing on the NSA as a threat is a bit of a red herring.
Right.
There are a great many threats of far greater magnitude than the NSA.
Well, and this is the interesting thing of, again, like we think of security has boundaries, right? We think of like where's the layers of security, and it's physical access to the building. Then let's assume, we're in an office. One day we'll be there again. But like I used to have this in my companies, and our corporate security people were very good. They'd say, like, we test access at the door. Okay, you need a card reader to get through the door. Great. Well, so do the cleaning staff, right? So they are in, and now they have access to your desk, which has a big old sheet of paper full of passwords on it. And they're not auditing logins. They don't know, like it looks like EW's doing it, but it's FEW, the cleaning team, who's, again, it doesn't need to be the NSA. There's so many ways in which, there's no way to stop that from happening. Oh, wait, there is. And we have this weird thing that if you put a lock on the door, that's it. Like, oh, we're safe now. Like, oh, like, no, you don't understand what bloody zero trust is. We call it zero trust for a reason. So
Yeah, right.
And now this is it's a tough problem to solve. And I think what's even more challenging, it's a tough problem to make people understand that they have, unless they've been on the wrong side of an incident, a breach, whatever you want to say, right? So I'm curious, Daniel, like you chose to go into a very difficult arena, and you're successful at it, but how did those first discussions go when you tell somebody, look, you need this, and they're like, no, we think there's a real unfortunate belief that people have got it sorted?
Those discussions don't go. To answer your question in the most direct manner possible, you have folks who understand that they need it, and you have folks who don't. And I think it's extraordinarily difficult to convince someone that they need this level of security if they don't understand what's going on. It's very difficult to educate a market. I think that's an if your business relies upon the idea of educating people that they need, some particular thing, it's not impossible. It just becomes more of an uphill battle. And the more
Right.
I think the right way to think about it is this: the more education you need, the more difficult it becomes. If you need to nudge people, if they need to be aware of like one additional fact, and that fact is then presented to them, they're like, "Oh, I didn't know about that one additional thing. That changes the whole landscape." Right? Maybe you get there, but if you have to put someone through a Microsoft certification course,
Yeah.
right? Or then you got a problem. So we actually try to avoid those conversations. Our sales and marketing is not focused on trying to convince people that they need this particular thing. What we're trying to do is find the people who already know that they need it and say it exists, because the biggest issue is really people just don't even know that it exists. And there are plenty of people who do. The market is so big. The market is sufficiently large. The market of folks who do recognize the importance of this is sufficiently large that when I get to the part where I have to worry about educating more people in order to grow the market, I'll already be in terrific shape.
Yeah, you'll be able to afford to build those campaigns.
Right. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Or the answer is
No,
we
it's
don't. We don't have those conversations. We
it,
avoid them. We avoid them like the plague.
yeah, no, and it makes sense. Like there is a very distinct and targeted audience. It's already out there.
Yeah.
That's why we have CISOs and we have these like I've been lucky enough through my career to see this arrive and like get why it was necessary. But it was funny when it first came in, people were like, what does a CISO? We had Sarbanes-Oxley compliance became a thing, and you'd like, oh yeah, it's just a checkbox. You're like, no, you don't understand. That person just signed. They are personally attributing themselves to our regulatory compliance, including security, including all these things. If we're in a breach, their name's on the contract. It's not a light duty thing. They are hyper aware of the risks that they're taking on when they do that. At least you bloody hope so. Like maybe they're not,
It's
and they're just
very difficult. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a very difficult seat. And I think anyone who is willing to sit in that seat is incredibly brave. And one hopes that that particular person is also very wise at the same time. And many of them are, right? Many of them are.
Yeah. Yeah, now this the interesting thing, of course, in the method by which you're solving it. You talk about distributed key. Let's go into a couple of examples of where that comes into play and how you actually manage it. Because I think that's also when people hear that, they think like, "Oh, I'm going to have to carry like 5 devices. It's a whole situation." Like, no, no, well, it's possible. We have the technology to make this process easier.
Yeah, well, what we do is we implant a microchip in your left arm, a microchip in your right arm, a microchip in your forehead, and a microchip in your left buttock. And those four, we call them A, B, C, and D. And but if you have any two of those four, you're in. No, okay, wait, maybe that's not what I'm not supposed to talk about that, right?
We're not quite there yet. Yeah, that's
My
the
marketing guy is gonna get mad at me for talking about that. No, we're not there yet. Um, the reality is that, and we can go back to the 2 of 4 example that I gave before, and I think that's a good example. You already have 2 devices, and you use them all the time. One is the computer that you use for work, and the other is your phone.
right.
And maybe you forget your phone at home, except right now most people don't really leave their homes very much, or
It's great.
or their laundry rooms. But people back in the day when society was a little bit more normal, even if you left your phone at home, you'd figure it out pretty quickly. You'd realize people are glued to their phones. Um, you already have 2 devices, and that's a great start. So if you need 2 of 4, right, and you have one shard of the key on the laptop on which you do your work, or the desktop on which you do your work, and then one shard of the key on your phone, you're already in pretty good shape. Why? Because if an attacker manages to get access to your computer, if the difficulty of getting access to your computer is X, right? Let's call that some value X. The difficulty of an attacker getting access to both your computer and your phone is not 2X. It's X to the something, right? It's X, pick, X to the n. Some much, it's far, far, far more difficult. Now, it's not impossible, right? In a targeted attack, it absolutely can happen.
Right.
But you've raised the bar. You've made the difficulty far greater than it had been in the past. Now, if you want to increase that to 3 devices, you've made it so you've reduced the probability of a successful incident to being extraordinarily remote. Again, it's not impossible, but you've changed it by orders of magnitude. So just by having 2 devices in the mix and having the security around both of those devices be in play, you've upped the ante materially for the attacker. And hopefully the attacker will say,
that's the whole thing, right? It's computationally difficult, and there's no way around it that's not computational. You can't shortcut it versus like user pass, a traditional like login password. I used to test this all the time. Just, I don't need to send people on a fishing expedition to try and see if I can expose them. I would just go to the lab room, which has a weird phone number, and it could say janitor's closet. And you just pick a person, you just dial an extension. You say, hey, this is Pete calling from the help desk. Looks like there may have been a problem. Can you just confirm what your password is? Oh, sure. Yeah. What's your username again? Most people it's calling from a corporate number. It's in the building. I'm at my desk. It's the help desk. They'll give it to you. They'll give it up faster than they would give $1 for an ice cream on a hot day. And so that's not a computational problem. But by making it a computational problem, you need a lot more than just that phone number from the janitor's closet and $1 for your ice cream.
That's right. And I think it's tougher to social engineer.
Yeah.
Right. Because it starts to sound far more suspicious if it's, hey, can you give me, it sounds suspicious immediately if someone's saying, give me your password.
Exactly.
It sounds even more suspicious if it's give me your password and now do some weird thing with your phone so that I have access to it. Again, some will fall for it. Some will, but the percentage just drops. It just drops materially. So, by adding more, people talk about one way to think of security or parameters around protecting a piece of data is something something you have, something you are, right? Something you are being biometric. And nowadays we've sort of combined the something you have with something you are, right? Phones tend to have biometric capability in them. But security tends to rely still, right? Often relies still only on one of those 2 things. And by making it rely on 2 of those 2, both of those things, more than one of those things, you've materially up the difficulty for the attacker.
It becomes and it's a classic. If you ask somebody like, what's your mother's maiden name? What's your first pet? Like the classic things, like we use the same questions over and over again. And I was laughing. You talk to a security person, you say like, what's your mother's maiden name? And it's like 3X-42,
right.
some Metallica lyrics, right. Like some bizarre thing. There's no way you could ever connect these 2 bloody things together. But like they know, like, all right, this is the thing.
That's where you use swear words. We're talking about swear words.
That's right.
Because if the phenomena of SIM hacking, right? It's tough. It's one of my favorite topics because I think it's a terrific attack.
Yeah.
And there's so little in the way of protection around it. One of the ways there are many things you can do to try to address it. Amongst them is to put a bunch of items in your profile that you know, the person on the other end of the phone would have to try to read back to you that they're not going to feel comfortable reading on the phone, right? including swear words, right? And put those sorts of things, embed that all over the place, right? Complex characters, all sorts of stuff that you can't read on the phone, right? That's not the solution, right? That's, you know, one element.
Yeah, and this is the now the interesting thing is we get this. We have, you know, sharded protection. Now, how do you protect the life cycle of that shard? And this is one thing I'm always curious. So you know, as an example, I used, I think it was Google Authenticator. One of them, I'm not going to pick on them necessarily. It was my own fault, right? I had it on my phone. Something went sideways. You know, hey, I back it up to iCloud. iCloud's, you know, safe. Like it's encrypted, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel comfortable with putting it there because I know it's like one of many factors. Well, my phone gets wiped because of some problem I bump into. Okay, get a new phone. Restore from iCloud. Ah, my Google Authenticator is empty. It didn't actually back up. And I'm like, huh, it's probably by design that they did
It is
that.
by design.
Yeah.
It's by design.
And then, of course, I go to the other system that I've enabled multi-factor authentication using an authenticator. And they say, well, we actually can't unlock it because we want you to have complete trust that we have no ability to do that. So I literally ended up with this orphaned off like software product that I can never unlock because I've lost the original key. My fault. I didn't have the backup, like the actual hash. I should have. So my bad. I totally own that. But it was funny. Like I literally backed myself. I painted myself into a proverbial corner there's no way out of. And I'm like, oh, this is all, it worked. But how do you protect normal people from making that simple mistake and thus not trusting themselves to do it? Which is,
Yeah, I
I
have to
think, why it's
disagree
tough
with
to
you.
adopt.
I have to disagree with you. It's not your fault. And the reason I say it's not your fault is that a system needs to be designed uh, in a way that balances security with redundancy, and that's very difficult. That doesn't excuse anybody from doing it. One of the things that Google Authenticator, I believe, didn't used to have, but now they most certainly do, is the ability to export
Right.
all of those TOTP codes, right? So now you have the ability to export them, I believe, 10 at a shot. So you have to install the Google. If you lose your phone, you got a problem. If you get the new phone, if you're replacing a phone, then you can export, 10 at a shot.
Yeah.
Or you can use when you're scanning that barcode, you can scan it on your phone and your tablet, right? And
Right.
then
Yeah.
have the ability to recover that way. Now, it is wise that they do not enable any sort of backup. And one of the problems with things like iCloud or in the Microsoft enterprise sphere, roaming profiles, right?
Right.
It's the same thing, right? We're going to take this local thing, we're going to encrypt it using, for example, your password. And then we're going to put this local thing over there in the cloud, right? And then you're going to get a new local thing and you're going to download the thing from the cloud and decrypt it with your password. And boom, you're good. A lot of steps, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And if somebody gets that password, now the thing's in it can create all sorts of problems. So I think Google was in a sense wise to prevent that from happening in the way that they have. Now, that said, it creates exactly the problem that you've described, right? Which is what happens when you lose your phone.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about threshold cryptography, and we use this thing called threshold cryptography, I'll talk about that in a bit. The nice thing about distributed key management is I talked about having 4 shards of the key, 4 pieces of the key. Piece A, piece B, piece C, and piece D. By the way, it doesn't need to be 4, it could be 7. Right? And then the threshold is the number of pieces needed to reassemble. So it could be 2, it could be 3, maybe you set it up in
Yeah.
5 of 8 mode, right? But it's any 2 of 4. So if you have piece A and piece B, you're good to go. If you have piece B and piece C, you're good to go. If you have piece D and piece A, you're good to go. Let's say your laptop has piece A, your phone has piece B, your tablet has piece C, and your colleague's phone has piece D, and you lose piece B, your phone.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so what? And we actually have a neat feature. We can actually take the remaining pieces of the key. So now we've lost piece B, but we have piece A, piece C, and piece D. And now you want to replace your phone, right? You don't want to permanently not have, what we can do is we can actually reshuffle those remaining shards and create new piece A, new piece B, new piece C, new piece D from any two of the original pieces. So we can use pieces C and D to create A prime, B prime, C prime, D prime.
You can
And then
reassemble and then you've still meet
send
the
those
threshold.
send those new pieces, A prime, B prime, C prime, and D prime, to the relevant devices. So A prime goes on your laptop, B prime goes on your new phone, C prime goes on your tablet, D prime goes on your colleague's phone, and boom, you're good to go. And by the way, C prime does not combine with original D.
Right. It's
Right?
a next generation.
It's a brand new, right? It's right, exactly. You, in a sense, that's a good way to put it. You've skipped forward a generation in a sense, right? So it's a terrific way of dealing with that problem. You need that redundancy, not in case you lose a phone, but when
Yeah.
phones will get lost, they will break, it will happen. If you have users, they will lose devices. It will happen, right? It's a certainty. So you need to be able to recover from that in a way that is both secure and relatively streamlined. And that's why I say it's not your fault, because you need to really think about designing systems that address both of those concerns. And that's the idea behind threshold cryptography.
Nice. But it's made it too, because I think of like even I was always mindful of that level of protection, but in the before that was like, so even my active directory, this is like a decade ago. The way I would protect it was we would generate our root level, passwords. So we always had this like kind of like the main, the top level password. You had the root access, and we would do is we would have 3 people. Each would come up with 6 characters, and then we would have all 3 of them there. So I type my 6 characters. The next person types their 6 characters. The next person types their 6 characters. We repeat it again. And then we take those 6 characters and we put them each in a separate sealed envelope. And we would then put it into a storage unit. And so that was like, I felt like the Winklevoss twins, like roaming around the United States, planting shards of their keys for their Bitcoins, right? But for us, it was always like, you couldn't just go get it. You had to go out of your way because you had to call Iron Mountain. Like it was a situation that you knew it was a real reason not to do it. And then it made you think about every other security process you have. You're like, if this is how we're treating the top, then let's do some better stuff down the middle. So that was, but that was pre, availability of good KMS, like, better use of other tools to do that type of protection. So
Yeah, and I think it also points out something interesting, which is that we have generations, thousands of years of experience in securing physical objects, whereas we have a couple of decades of experience securing bits and bytes.
right.
And one of the things that we've tried to do with some degree of success is translate the security of bits and bytes into the security of physical objects to whatever degree we can. And that's sort of what you've just described. And it makes people feel a lot more comfortable. First of all, it's more intuitive. It's more understandable. Right? You
Right.
can explain to, if you're the CISO, you can explain to the CFO, who may not be as technical, how you've done this thing, and your explanation will make sense to the CFO. Whereas you talk about good KMS, the CFO is gonna be like, what's good? Mike, what's a
Exactly.
good KMS? What's that? How did that work? What are you talking about? Right. So
we use a SHA-256 algorithm and it gets supported. You know, like they're like, sorry, what?
how is that going to affect my capex for the coming year?
Exactly.
So in any event, I think the translation of look, I think what you've described there is not so bad. It's you were doing the best with what you had, and it's what you've done is you've actually made it quite secure, but you've also made it quite clumsy to recover. But
Right.
it's not unrecoverable. It is recoverable versus the example you gave before of, Google Authenticator before without the backup, right?
Yeah.
Uh, which is recoverable. Distributed key management is what I would describe as sort of the more sophisticated version of what you had implemented with your Iron Mountain split root password scheme. And I actually like your Iron Mountain split root password scheme. I think that's fine, right? It's just sort of a royal pain in the neck and kind of makes people a little nervous and stuff like that. But distributed key management, in the context of what I'm describing, is intended to fill that gap. It's intended to achieve the same goal, but do it in a way that's easier to do, easier to address if something goes wrong, just as secure, maybe not as understandable, maybe not as intuitive to the CFO, but probably sufficiently intuitive. You could explain it, and that'll get you there. That's the goal of what we've done. One of the goals.
Yeah. Well, the thing that comes up with this, like we think the first thing you have to do is not just relate the solution, but relate it to the asset you're protecting. So, I mean, we can talk about corporate assets, it's files, it's personally identifiable information, it's customer information, whatever it's going to be. But that's like, so as a general use case, and I wouldn't mind exploring stuff that's, maybe outside the wheelhouse of Atakama directly right now. But what if that asset you're protecting, what if that file is a money asset, right? So Bitcoin and crypto coin and cryptocurrency suddenly, and I use the sort of the Winklevoss description for anybody that hasn't read Bitcoin Billionaires by Ben Mesrick. It's a fantastic story, and it but this is the level we got to go to, because I don't have TD to protect my account necessarily, or like they've got their layers of protection. Well, a Bitcoin, like, do I store an offline wallet? What do I keep in my online wallet? Do I write my keys down and separate? Like, I'd love to get your take on why most people are about to make big mistakes with how they protect their crypto assets.
Oof, that's a big topic.
I know we need a whole hour on that one.
No. Let me do my best with it. Security for keys for crypto assets is a darn mess. I'm getting a notification here that says that my internet is weak and that I should be prioritizing audio over video.
Yeah, luckily we can still hear you. I've lost this.
Okay.
I've lost the video for the moment, but you're coming through loud and clear on the sound.
I'm actually gonna stop the video for a moment until this thing goes away.
Yeah, all good.
I don't want it to. There we go. I'll turn it back on when I. Okay. So, crypto assets, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all these other things are bearer assets, and the bearer asset is your private key. Right, it's your private key to sign that transaction to enable you to move that Bitcoin from address A to address B. That's what these things are. And you lose that private key, you're toast. Somebody else gets that private key, you're toast. And that creates all sorts of problems. We've never had a situation in the past where money, or a money-like asset, whatever you want to call it, is based on possession of a private key. And here comes this strong desire to try and translate security of bits and bytes into physical security. That's what everyone wants to do, and that intuition is not crazy. It makes sense. It's very difficult to do. What I will say is that built into Bitcoin, built into Ethereum is the concept of multi-sig, where you have the ability to generate multiple keys and to require multiple signatures, some threshold, right? 2 of 3, 3 of 5, pick your threshold, right? In order to affect the transaction.
Right.
And that's a good solution, right? That's a good solution. But then you have to figure out where you store those keys. So they have sort of built-in distributed key management. Now, beyond that, you could also do distributed key management just with one key and then cutting that key into shards, and you effectively get the same thing. And either way you do it. And what I'll also say is that some of the earliest Bitcoin wallets going back to 2012, maybe even 2011.
That's right. It was a thing before it was a thing. People forget that.
Well, I will tell you. I'll tell you right now. The one that I'm thinking of was a wallet called Bitcoin Armory. Really good wallet. It used to call the Cadillac of Bitcoin wallets, I believe. And that thing had built into it Shamir's secret sharing scheme for the backup of keys. Shamir's secret sharing scheme is one of the sort of the classic threshold cryptography algorithm by a guy named Adi Shamir of RSA, right? That's the S in RSA. A very famous cryptographer, brilliant human being, and he came up with this thing called Shamir's secret. Try and say it 5 times. Shamir's secret sharing scheme. Shamir's secret sharing scheme. Anyway,
as it makes it secure, you can't even say the name.
You can't even say it, right? You can't even say it, right? So, look, I think what you're talking about is that the security of crypto assets and how best to do that presents a tremendous challenge. And there are, I think, 2 big approaches. Right? One is keep your keys offline, which you can do, right? And there are hardware devices out there today, Trezor, Ledger, Cold Card. There's a whole slew of them that'll enable you to keep your keys offline. And some of the classic Bitcoin wallets can be run offline if you know how to do it. And sort of that's a more technical thing, kind of a pain in the neck. Not for the average Joe, probably.
Right.
And then you've kept your keys offline, but then you have this other problem of, well, what if you lose that thing?
That's right.
What if you lose it? What if you lose that thing? And that's where I think the use of threshold cryptography can come into play, right? So the way to mitigate that is to split that thing, right? Split that key into pieces and use a threshold cryptography like system in order to do that. And the combination of threshold cryptography plus offline key management gives you pretty strong security and pretty good redundancy at the same time. And that is the approach that I would recommend if someone said, I have a whole boatload of Bitcoin, how should I secure it? And my answer would be the combination of offline, you keep it with cold storage, so to speak, and distributed key management. So and there are a slew of different ways to combine those 2 things, but you'd combine those 2 things, and that's how you have a very strong security. You could use one of those 2 things, and you'd be, in far, far better shape than you would be just with an online wallet.
Yeah.
Right. So there are a lot of ways to do it. The default for those who I think are a little less technical is to leave their crypto assets in the custody, in the storage. I'm not going to use the word custody because I don't like that word in this context. In the storage system of an exchange, and we have seen that go awry so many times.
Right.
And you have no recourse. You are toast. There is nothing you can do. That's the thing that I would recommend avoiding like the plague. Please don't store your crypto assets. Don't store your Bitcoin. Don't store your Ethereum with an exchange. Please don't do it. If you are insufficiently experienced, and that's not a knock on anybody. I mean, this stuff is complicated.
No, that's it. It's an algorithmically challenging problem that is There are more people trying to break it than to make it.
Yes, it's the biggest bug bounty in the world, right? I mean, you figure there's the Bitcoin is the biggest bug bounty in the world. Figure find a bug, find a way to steal coin, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the whole thing is like
what I would
Mount Gox wasn't an anomaly because it was broken. It's an anomaly that it's the only one we know of, right? Like,
there are so many more that we know of. That's the
yeah,
thing; they're just not well publicized. There was a paper. I wish I could dig it out. Maybe I could dig it out and send it to you after this. Of the sort of like the average life of a Bitcoin exchange. Now, this is from a few years ago, and I think the exchange ecosystem has become somewhat more stable, at least in Western, in developed market countries.
yeah.
um, but it was some very short amount of time. It was like a year and a half, and then either the exchange gets shut down or it gets hacked or some god awful thing happens, and then you're toast. And Mount Gox is the most famous one, but there are so many others that where some where something what was the what am I thinking of? I can't. I'm blanking on it right now. There were two others that are that are fairly large that had incidents. Um, One that operates largely in I can't think of it right now. I'll try and I'll shoot you a note after
Yeah,
the
yeah.
show, and you can put them in the show notes if you want. But these incidents happen all the time. But even worse than that, it's not just an incident that could happen at the level of the exchange, but at the level of the user. So if someone gets a user's credentials, then they're going to get into the user's account on the exchange and just steal the user's assets, and the exchange is going to say it's not our fault, you used weak credentials. And
Right.
this is where stuff like sim hacking comes into play. You have any exchange that even permits the use of SMS as a second factor is doing something that is, in my view, irresponsible. But some of them still do. And then somebody gets sim hacked, and then you're out of luck. So what I was going to let me summarize all this without me going on a giant rant on a podcast. It doesn't make sense to go on a giant rant.
That's what it's
Summary.
for. That's why I go
Yeah,
long form.
exactly. Yeah. Summary. Please don't keep your Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything else stored with an exchange. Just don't do it. Instead, go on Amazon and buy a Ledger or a Trezor or something else. There are an abundance of other solutions that nowadays don't require a tremendous amount of technical knowledge and can be utilized by someone who's just sort of an enthusiast, right? But not necessarily someone who has a degree in computer science.
Yes,
And those solutions are abundant.
and I guess that's the trick is like there probably it's been a long time since it would have been hard to explain banking as a new thing. But at one point, there was probably that same conversation of like, now wait a second. So I've got my gold over here, and you're going to take it and you're going to put it somewhere, and you're going to write down that I got this much gold, and then I can get it when I need it. And like, I don't trust this. Like that's literally centuries, of distance from that. So it's funny that we have to reintroduce this idea that there's a lot of people out here where this will not be intuitive for, but those are probably
Mm-hmm.
people that shouldn't be dabbling in crypto exchanges and cryptocurrency in general. It's not exactly a mass market appeal at the moment. Or, well,
I
I guess it's how do I should that's a weird statement. It shouldn't be because of there's a lot of stuff wrapped around it. The average person shouldn't be taking their stimulus check and going on to Coinbase and buying crypto. I wouldn't recommend it. May work out, but it works out as well as a slot machine.
fair, but the problem is the average person does, right?
Right.
This is the
Yeah,
thing, right? So if you're, harm reduction, right? If so, if the average person is going to take their stimulus check and go on to Coinbase and buy a bunch of Bitcoin, what can we do to try and prevent them from losing what they
that's right.
purchased, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I would say, you know, go get one of these hardware devices, or go find one of the many other ways of keeping your Bitcoin secure that involve keeping your keys offline or using some sort of multi-sig or distributed key management system. And there are things out there that don't have the level of technical sophistication requirements that would be inaccessible to that average person who used their stimulus check to purchase Bitcoin. And by the way, I don't begrudge that. People are going to do
No,
what they
no, and it's
want,
funny. It's
right?
always
Yeah, it's like,
it's such
look
a
at
funny
it.
thing that I always pick these poor examples that they're real, but it's unfortunately real. I'll say is the description of it because
Right. The
of
unfortunate part is that people end up getting victimized, right? That's right.
right.
And I absolutely agree that is tremendously unfortunate. And we should, those of us who operate in the security community should really try our best to help folks from prevent themselves from becoming victims. And I'm happy to do that. And people ask my advice, and I do the best that I can to provide reasonable guidance. And I'm not a genius here. I just tell them sort of the basics of what I know, and I think that those basics will get you a great distance relative to sort of what people know offhand, which is kind of not that much.
Well, and I think of it as like it's like common sense weight management techniques. I'm not trying to teach you how to fast and go down to 4 hours a day of an eating window and keto manage your intake and like people won't do it because it's complex. It's the same over here in this situation, right? But if you tell them, "Hey, look, kind of keep track of what you eat and keep track of what you do, and one should be better than the other." Oh, okay, I can kind of work that out. Like if we can give that level of comfort to people, it gives us a chance to more broadly adopt the ecosystem. And then the technology will catch up to the usability and the user experience will be smoother. And then more of the traditional non-technical consumer will be able to easily participate in these markets, which is, I think, I mean, that's why we're right. The time we're recording this, it's buoyed up to about a 51K for a single Bitcoin. You know, God knows what that poor fellow who paid for his dominoes with Bitcoin, what it would be worth at the moment. But it is it's an odd ecosystem. I'm excited by it, but I'm also like I'm sitting on the outside in a weird way, kind of waiting for the weirdness to happen to remind people that it's decentralized markets like this and free markets, they are we have a dependency that the financial market is stable and structured. It's almost accidental that it was.
Sure,
And then
sure.
you add technology to it. You add, the ability to create, so again, I say this as I'm excited. I dig into it. I understand it a bit more than maybe, many folks would. And I understand the sort of frivolity of me diving into the market and treating it as measurable and predictable. Most people don't have, they just think like, I'm going to buy Bitcoin. It's going to go up by 200 times because, I hear about it all the time. Or they go into Robinhood. And that was the funny thing. Like people wondered, like, why did Robinhood stop, trading on GameStop? Well, because Robinhood is in a regulated industry and they could no longer capitalize their trades. So they had to stop trading. It wasn't because they were trying to stop people from buying GameStop. They had to stop people. That was the one that was going to put them over the edge. The unfortunate part was they chose not to say that until they had stopped trading on it for a couple of days. And then they said, oh, by the way, here's the actual reason why we had to do that, because we were undercapitalized and we would have been on the wrong side of regulatory compliance. So, I mean, but that's why I like this sort of Wild West. You don't have to be a fan of Charlie Shrem to believe that there's going to be some real people doing interesting things that may be dancing a careful line, and they may dance on the wrong side of the line a little too often.
People are doing very interesting things. I think it's a fascinating ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that I've been, following in one sense or another for 10 years.
It's amazing, eh?
Wow.
Like it
Yeah,
seems like it's not that long ago, but it's a decade that this has been an
it's a
active
decade.
ecosystem, right?
It's a decade, and it has matured tremendously over that decade. But that doesn't mean that the wild westy feel to it has dissipated. On the contrary, I would say the wild westy feel to it has just changed in in the components that are wild westy, right? Versus, back in the day, I think there were more exchanges, for example, that were wild westy.
Right.
Now, perhaps there are fewer exchanges that are wild westy, but nowadays there are sort of more instruments that are wild westy. Right? You have all this DeFi stuff. You have all this stuff uh, that isn't. At first we just had Bitcoin. Now we have more assets than I can count. And that's sort of, in a sense, the more wild westy. We have distributed exchanges. That's sort of wild westy in a sense.
Yeah.
And the Wild West was an incredible place insofar as you could make a lot of money and you could also get killed.
That's right.
And right. I don't know I can't tell you what the probability was of making a lot of money, and I can't tell you what the probability was of getting killed, but I know both of those things happen on a regular basis. Right. So, and that's what attracts people, I think, is it's exciting, it's interesting, it's new, it's different, and that great. We're all sitting on our, at home nowadays, stuck in our houses, right? We should be doing something that's exciting, right? We can't
That's
leave our
right.
houses, right? So I certainly understand that. And there are many other reasons, many other. This is too big. So it's a very big topic. Um, Many other reasons for people to get involved in the Bitcoin and crypto asset ecosystem. Um, Besides just the fact that it's quote exciting. Um, but I think bottom line, people will use their stimulus checks in this way. Of course they will.
Yeah.
And I think it's a tremendously important thing for the security community to do, for us to sort of focus on how can we tell people to keep them, how can we help people keep themselves secure? And
Yeah.
so that's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, no, it's good. Hey, bet you didn't think you'd wake up this morning and be sitting in your laundry room talking about the downfalls of cryptocurrency and stimulus check usage. How's that for a
Well,
fun
you never
day in the
know.
day?
I stopped predicting a long time ago.
Well, and you know, given your background, you came from the finance world, so it is interesting that you are truly kind of like the triad of all the things that are important in this ecosystem because you understand the finance side of it, you understand how traditional markets work, you also understand the technology of security, and then in the midst of that, you're a pretty darn good behaviorist. So it is interesting to there are not many people who have that kind of understanding like you do, and I'm excited by first I say just Atakamas in general, like the problem you're solving is tough and I know it, but it's fantastic in the way that you're doing it. And then beyond this thing, because you're young, so in the next decade I kind of predict you're going to be doing some pretty fantastic things in other ecosystems as well.
Well, so thank you. I kind of round tripped it in a sense, insofar as I started out more in the tech in the tech world. I was always sort of a tinkerer and into math and science and computers when I was a kid. I always thought that would be what I did, quote, when I grow up, unquote. And when I was in college, I studied physics and studied electrical engineering. So, I figured I'd come out and I ended up being an engineer. Uh, so always knew how to write a few tidbits of code poorly. So, lots of bugs. Right, I wouldn't trust myself to write the code. Nowadays I'm the CEO. We have tons of terrific developers, and I understand what they write, but I don't trust myself to write it because it'll just have bugs and crash. Um, but yeah, so I think, and then I ended up going into traditional finance, not quantitative finance, but rather, traditional finance. You're working for a bunch of investment funds, and then ended up kind of looking at a lot of Bitcoin stuff and stuff like that, and then ended up running a software company. So that's why I say I sort of round tripped it. I think that the next decade is going to be such a tremendous time for advances in the way we think about capital markets, and the way we think about finance in general. I think that the addition of Bitcoin and crypto assets to the fray, and some of the things that have happened in that context, are demonstrative of sort of demand from the market that remains unfulfilled. And let me give you an example. Let me tell you, sort of talk a little more about what I mean by that, so it's not so abstract. Back in 2017, 2018, we saw this big craze of ICOs. And what's an ICO, right? It's really a mechanism of capital formation. It's a mechanism for people to raise money. Now, you could say the token is a utility token, and it's going to be used in the ecosystem that the developers are building. Okay, and that the profit model is different. It's not based on it. It's not a traditional operating business, income statement based business model where you have revenue and you have expenses and then you have profits. Instead, we're going to use this thing and the system, and by virtue of the fact that we're using it, the value of the token is going to increase. Okay, maybe, or maybe maybe the world just needed a way for people to raise capital without all of the constraints of the traditional financial services ecosystem, which makes it a royal pain in the neck to raise capital. If you think, you're the average, if you run a dry cleaner, right? You run a mom and pop shop dry cleaner and you want to raise money, you can't go around with a piece of paper and say, hey, I'm raising money, and staple that to a bunch of telephone poles with your phone number and say, hey, I'm raising money, give me a call. That's illegal. That's a general solicitation, and the SEC prohibits that. And that, I mean, if you think about it, it's a little extreme. Mom and pop can't raise money to expand their dry cleaner by putting posters on telephone poles. Like, you could put lost dog posters on there, right? But if you want to do this basic thing, you can't do it. And those restrictions were the birth of the venture capital ecosystem. Right? Why do we have venture capitalists? Why does this exist at all? It's not because necessarily they're great at picking businesses. It's because people who wanted to raise money for a new thing needed someplace to go. They can't put up a sign in Times Square and say, hey, I want to raise money. That's illegal. So you have these investors to whom you can solicit, and it is legal. And what you've done is you've created this very tightened ecosystem. You've created this very tightened area in which people can raise money. And that changes the cost of capital. That makes it more expensive to raise money. It makes it more difficult. And what it does is it stymies innovation. And innovation, if fewer people can create startups, you will have fewer startups. If you have fewer startups, you will have fewer success stories. If you have fewer success stories, you will have reduced economic growth. You'll have fewer people who get to celebrate the fact that they built something terrific. And so, why am I? Let me bring this full circle. So what did ICOs do? They short-circuited that. ICOs were in many ways regulatory arbitrage. You used the Ethereum blockchain to create an ERC20 token, and then you sold the thing, and you raised a bunch of money for your thing. Now, most of the things that ended up being capitalized through this process ended up being garbage.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
They were the pirates of the world. They were the first ones that are like, I'm just going to try to wing it. Let's just see if this works.
Right. Anyway, most of that stuff ended up being garbage. But what it showed is that there is this sort of, I hate the phrase pent up demand, but I'll use it, pent up demand for the ability to raise capital on a general solicitation basis without all of the constraints applied by regulators and the traditional capital markets and all this stuff, all this dead weight that we don't need. And one of the reasons why I think the next decade is going to be fascinating is the advent of using a public blockchain, right, like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, right, for these sorts of purposes opens up a slew of possibilities. And I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what we're going to see. We've recently seen this whole craze of non-fungible tokens, NFTs.
Yes, I
Now,
was going to say
right,
NFTs are the next thing where we can go on this one.
right. Now, personally, I think it's a little bit goofy. I get it. I think it's a little bit. I get it. I think it's a little bit goofy, but I think it just goes to show, right? There is a desire for digital collectibles, right? That desire exists. Now, how best can we fulfill that desire? Right. But we had no way at all of fulfilling that desire before. Now we have sort of what I'll describe as like a kind of clumsy way of doing it. Right. So what comes next? Right. Well, now that we know that the desire is there, maybe some entrepreneur comes and shows up and says, okay, I'm going to find a better way to do this. So there's my diatribe on the crypto ecosystem and what I think it really demonstrates, which is that there are all these different possibilities, and we haven't had the tools necessary to demonstrate what the pent up demand is. Like what is there demand for, right? There's demand for all these things, and the emergence of the crypto ecosystem is one of the things that enabled us to see what is there pent up demand for.
Yeah, and that's just it, right? If we haven't experienced the beginning of an ecosystem in a long time, and there's going to be a lot of very weird and interesting stuff around regulatory boundaries around it. Like there is no FDIC for crypto exchanges. Like there's a lot of work to create one. Then it becomes the counterbalance, but it's not really a counterbalance because it's generally a little more heavily weighted than the consumer side. There's a lot of very interesting areas, and like I said, yeah, NFTs. Hey, look, I'd rather somebody pay $2.6 million for Jack Dorsey's first tweet than they're out in Africa hunting elephants for tusks. If you're going to collect weird stuff,
That's true.
I'd rather you collect Jack's old tweets. Like,
That's true.
So it's an interesting time. And wow, I said you can cover a lot of ground. This has been a fantastic discussion, and thanks very much, Daniel, for taking the time. I could
My
spend all
pleasure.
day digging into more of this stuff, but Atakama, really cool, doing neat stuff. We'll have links, of course, in the show notes. And if folks want to connect with you and want to find out more and chat on various things, where's the best place to reach you?
Oh, you can ping me through our website, which is atakama.com, atakama.com. We are a small but growing team, and if you leave a message there, I am likely to get it.
Nice, excellent. Well, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. I'd love to reconnect as this ecosystem continues to heat up and evolve, and both to hear how you're doing at Atacama, and yeah, because you've got such a broad knowledge on this stuff. As we see, the world is going to be very interesting as the world opens up, the crypto world opens up. A lot of things are going to change in the coming year and definitely in the coming decade.
I agree, and it's going to be It's going to be fascinating to watch, and fascinating for those who can participate, and for those who choose to participate, and hopefully they can stay secure while they're doing
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
And it's going to be terrific.
It is going to be a wild time, but a wild in the right ways. Thing like you said, I love this description that the Wild West created fantastic opportunities, and then from there, we had the settlers, and then a lot of time happens, but as the settlers settle and the world evolves around it. But you got to start with the Wild West somehow.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.